operate in strictest secrecy at the cutting edge of Australia's defence. They're creative, unorthodox and comfortable in chaos. For over 50 years, the Australian SAS has put their lives at risk, deep behind enemy lines. This is the only television history ever supported by this highly secretive regiment. We take you beyond the stereotypes to reveal the unexpected story of the real people who transformed SAS from the ugly duckling of the Australian Army into pride of place as Australia's force of choice. In September 1999, the East Timorese people voted for independence from Indonesia. Bloody fighting broke out across the little nation. In October, independence guerrilla leader Janana Gusmao was finally released from house arrest in Jakarta and returned to his beloved East Timor. For his safety, he was brought in from Darwin to a safe house in Dili by an Australian SAS bodyguard.
The SAS regiment were the unit of choice in East Timor.
East Timor's violent transition to independence from Indonesia would trigger a complex test of international diplomacy and military strategy. In the conflict, Australian SAS soldiers would help prove a bold new strategic paradigm rarely seen in modern conflict. The defeat of depraved savagery by resolute de-escalation and true reconciliation. In Portugal, 25 years earlier, the authoritarian regime was deposed in a popular, peaceful left-wing military coup, the so-called Carnation Revolution. With Portuguese rule gone, Indonesia sent its military forces into neighbouring East Timor in a bloody bid to expand its territory. Aided by lawless militia, it was a sickening slaughter. The advancing Indonesians also murdered 5 Australian journalists in Balibo.
Hoje, quando muitos governos deviam envergonhar-se da sua cumplicidade no genocídio perpetrado em Timor-Leste pelos indonésios.
Janana Gusmao was the leader of Falantil, determined East Timorese freedom fighters who vowed never to cut their hair until independence from Indonesia was won. Despite the ongoing guerrilla war, thousands of Indonesian settlers moved into the now annexed Indonesian province of East Timor, protected by a large garrison of Indonesian National Armed Forces, the TNI. In 1992, Gusmao was betrayed. Gusmao was tried and jailed for life, but from his Jakarta prison he continued the guerrilla war against the TNI through his tough deputy, Tawa Matan Ruak. In Australia, the SAS had been monitoring these grave tensions within the arc of instability.
Following the fall of Suharto in 1998 and the Asian financial crisis that it precipitated, we maintain a very firm eye on the potential for Indonesia to destabilise right across the archipelago.
SAS had already made contact with Falantil Commander Ruak using the bush transmitter of East Timorese expatriates in Darwin.
Camaradas, daqui de Darwin.
SAS planning for both green and black operations into East Timor was well advanced.
Timor was becoming a lot higher priority to us. So In preparation for any area we're going to go in, we'd actually practice cultural training. So the environment, studies of the history, what the family structures were like, how people lived in villages, sensitivity with gender, the sensitivity with children, how to actually interact with people, actually getting people from that country to talk to us. Also, things that, you know, were humorous, because to build a relationship, you've got to understand those things.
And they're very friendly. Most of them speak Tetum, or the Indonesian language.
East Timorese speak any one of 4 local languages and are predominantly Catholic. Historically, Australians have had a special regard for the Timorese people. In World War II, the heroic Timorese guerrillas, assisted by Australia's independent commando company Sparrow Force, tied down an entire Japanese division moving towards Australia.
Victory!
1998, Prime Minister John Howard writes a letter to President Habibie. In that letter, he urges him to consider a way ahead for an expression of independence or otherwise by the people of East Timor. President Habibie, quite surprisingly, says, well, I agree that we should do this, and in fact, let's get moving on it. We'll conduct a plebiscite to see whether or not the people of East Timor want to be independent. Of course, in East Timor, opinion was divided on whether there should be independence or not.
As the referendum approached, law and order collapsed.
The political forces of the pro-integrationists started to assemble, and you started to see strong predation by armed groups, intimidating people they thought were pro-independence.
In April 1999, anti-independence militia and TNI massacred many people in Laquisha Churchyard and Dili. In June, Habibie, under pressure from Washington, agreed to allow a UN police force to supervise the independence referendum.
The first military connection with East Timor came not through mainstream units, but through having our own people over there as part of the UN monitoring force.
SAS had done its homework of profiling its main threat, the militia gangs.
The militia were of 2 apparent types. They were the thugs, the guys that were paid to. Almost invariably they were just local layabouts from within Dili, and most of the thugs were just carrying machetes and parangs and sort of make-do swords. The hardened elements were carrying SKS carbines and the like, and you knew what you were up against when you saw armed individuals. You should make no mistake about it, a TNI strategy has always been, since the independence of Indonesia from the Dutch, to generate a local level of security through the fostering of local militia elements. And they did not want to see any form of independence in East Timor.
A lot of these militia had been whipped up into a frenzy by Indonesian operatives, both from Kopassus and their national intelligence agency, CIA equivalent type organisation. There was a black operation going in Indonesia. We knew this from sources of information. It would have been an element of BAKEN, which is the Indonesian National Intelligence Agency. And one of the measures we know was to whip these militia people into a killing type frenzy. And we know that they used drugs to maintain this
rage for a period of time. You know, you had to be very careful. It wasn't like soldier on soldier. It was like soldier dealing with madmen here.
Civil war between the militia and Falentil would give Indonesia an excuse to re-invade.
I gave the order to Tarmatan to avoid direct confrontation with the militias, because I said we fought for independence. We have to avoid entering into a civil war. I ordered them to be in a cantonment in few places and not to participate in the voting process.
Despite the militia violence, on September 4, 1999, the East Timorese voted overwhelmingly for independence from Indonesia. Outraged, the vengeful militia rampaged, murdering at will, torching Dili. Fearing for their lives, many East Timorese fled into the hills. Here they felt some security because, although invisible, Falentil were nearby. But in Dili, hundreds scaled the high fence into the UN compound, which was then besieged by homicidal militia.
I had the call from Headquarters SF in Sydney to stand to a force for our worst possible nightmare. That is, that we may be required to go into Dili with or without the solid understanding or approval of the Indonesian government to pull people out. You'll recall this was that very human story where you saw babies being thrown over the fence and so on, and we thought we might have to mount a last-ditch measure to save the remaining people in the compound. We actually came up with a plan to use SAS in East Timor in early 1999. Well before our subsequent commitment in September of that year. We were well ahead of the game. Quite complicated, involving force projection from Tyndall and Darwin, staging through what we call lily pads or ships at sea to refuel the helicopters, dropping tanks on the southern coast of East Timor as required, flying and seizing Dili Airport, and then moving forward from Dili Airport into the compound by a variety of means, one of which involved landing a helicopter bang in the middle of the compound, not unlike the Son Tay raid from Vietnam days. The compound dominated by very hilly ground. There were militia people up there taking pot shots. You know, a couple of rounds could have brought a helicopter down. Very scary, very high risk activity.
The Defence Minister and I received a briefing this morning from General Cosgrove.
Despite the terrible risks, Canberra ordered Operation Spitfire to launch.
We're at the stage we had troops sitting beside the helicopters, ready to go, ready to launch. There's a term we call earliest available launch time. We were down to 0.
The CDF at the time, Admiral Chris Barry, asked me in a personal conversation what did I think were the chances of the success of a special recovery operation in those circumstances. I indicated to him that I thought they would very likely lead to the loss of life. Probability of success was around about the 20 to 30% level.
Initially, the whole unit was going to pick up in helicopters and fast rope and rescue everybody that was there. And I think that would have been another incident like Black Hawk Down, because there were so many guns in town, RPGs, all that sort of stuff.
Incredibly high risk, but we didn't do it.
Indonesia had suddenly agreed to the evacuation by the Australian Air Force, but only of UN personnel.
The SAS Regiment were the unit of choice to help protect what was largely an RAAF operation, to fly aircraft into 2 places in East Timor, Dili and into Baucau, to pick up plane loads of UN officials, etc. Troopers of the Special Air Service Regiment would accompany the flights in, protect them while they were filling up full of passengers, and then accompany the flights out.
The sensitive operation was led by SAS Commander Tim McCowan.
We had the very traumatic experience on a number of occasions where locally engaged staff from the UNIMIT mission were pleading to go out to be evacuated because their lives were under threat, and we weren't able or authorised to take some of those individuals out until the following day.
McCowan found the Mercy mission was vulnerable to contradictory intelligence.
There was no doubt about it. A good deal of the strategic advice that was being provided from both Jakarta and from within Canberra was at odds with the raw intelligence which I had access to, which did not seem to be given credence in Canberra. That's a pretty contentious thing to say, but it's true.
It seemed that despite reassurances from Jakarta and Canberra, the militia might attack Operation Spitfire, unhindered or even helped by the TNI.
I remember the short flight from Darwin over the top of East Timor and into Comoro airfield. Dili was still on fire. There was great palls of black smoke everywhere. Indonesian Air Force Special Forces individuals that were running the defences of Comoro Airport during Op Spitfire, they were clearly resentful of the fact that Australia was there. They were clearly distrustful of us.
The Indonesian weapons were pointing into the airfield and not outwards in case of militia attack.
I made sure that I had Bahasa and Tetum speakers in the initial deployments. The SAS soldiers were able to engage many of the guards outside the compound in either Tetum or Bahasa, and they were able to de-escalate that situation.
You could hear them talking amongst themselves. These guys are very well armed, they're very well dressed, they seem very, very disciplined. When you come across to them and you say, you know, I know exactly what you're saying and I thank you for the compliments and all that, they seemed a bit surprised by it and had a bit of a laugh, and then you'd see they relaxed a fair bit.
I think we did 7 sorties from Tyndall via Darwin and then into Comoro to take out evacuees.
The situation's inhuman. They're being driven from their homes, threatened and terrorised, firing of automatic rifles into their homes, burning of their homes, displacing of people running short of food. I mean, it's a systematic reign of terror.
The Indonesian army, they must learn to be democratic people, huh? Not to be a feudal army, authoritarian army, but respect the human rights, respect other people, their civilization, their culture and their identity.
Canberra suddenly ordered McCowan also to evacuate Archbishop Carlos Bello, the outspoken critic of Indonesian rule. The militia wanted Bello dead.
Violence was getting worse. Needed to get Bishop Bello out. The point of doing that was Bacau Airfield, a very small contingent, between 8 and 10. We also took some more high-end communications and medical staff as well. I got to say, for me, when we got on the ground, it was the first time I'd seen people frightened in a really meaningful way. You could see in their eyes.
But news of Bello's attempt to escape had leaked.
The UNIMIT MLO network told us that he was there, so they were using insecure radios and talking about the fact that Archbishop Bello was moving to the Bacau airfield and that the Australian aircraft was going to move to that location to pick them up. And within 30 minutes, James McMahon reported to me via secure UHF SATCOM that they were met by a militia element up there who threatened to kill Bello.
They were organised, very organised. They came in vehicles, they had small arms and normal submachine gun weapons. You know, we were negotiating. You know, every time the negotiation didn't go to their liking, there were sort of guns waved in front of us, you know, at my head, at my 2IC's head. So that was an interesting day. I earned my large salary that day. And while all that was happening, we actually managed to get the Bishop organised and onto the aircraft in a very discreet manner. We also managed to get, I think it was around 140, 150 people on the C-130, which, considering they take about 60, was a fairly big effort. I remember almost having to sort of, as we were putting the ramp up, sort of, you know, just push people in.
The militia blocked the runway, but the Australian Defence Attaché from Jakarta, Brigadier Jim Molan, persuaded them that Bello would be flown only to Dili. The militia fired at the C-130 anyway as it took off, but it flew direct to Darwin, not Dili. On 8th September, in a belated bid to halt the bloodshed, Indonesia declared martial law in East Timor. It was a half-hearted effort. When it failed to stop the violence, President Habibie agreed to a United Nations International Peacekeeping Force for East Timor, or Interfet. The Interfet force would be almost 50% Australian. In Jakarta, rioting crowds attacked the Australian embassy. The Timorese militia vowed to kill all Australians in East Timor, both soldiers and civilians. In command of Interfet was the Australian General Peter Cosgrove, an astute infantryman. His UN brief was to take any necessary steps in East Timor.
That meant I could have brought tanks in or used artillery. Never intended to do that, but permitted under that regulation.
This is not a time for idle threats or words.
Cosgrove launched Operation Stabilise, where Interfet would restore law and order in East Timor.
We will be here to ensure that all East Timorese are able to go about their ordinary business free of threat.
I needed to build up forces very quickly in Dili. I said to the logisticians, the movers, I need 2 infantry battalions on the ground in the first 24 hours.
Cosgrove flew to Dili on 19th September with his SAS bodyguard.
And that was to set the arrangements in place for the major trooper deployment on the 20th. On the 19th, it occurred to me that while the place looked like Dodge City, it was likely that the Indonesians fervently hoped there would be no major firefight when the troops came in. I felt that the intent, and if you like the goodwill, was there to prevent our 2 countries, or Indonesia and the UN sanctioned force, from falling into a conflict.
But as a precaution, Cosgrove left his SAS bodyguard in Dili to warn of any last-minute danger to the Australian Interfet troops. The next day, the transports loaded their troops and headed for Dili.
Now the 1RAA aircraft were in the sky, launched out of Townsville in, probably up to 10 aircraft. So that entire airborne force waiting for a clear live message to come from us to say the airport's secure, in you come. We didn't know what we were going to get into. Because I could speak Indonesian, Tim asked me to be the first guy out of the plane so I could actually speak to whoever was going to meet us. I remember getting off the aircraft, walking towards the Indonesian colonel, saluting him, international media going off left, right and centre, the Australian Defence Attaché being there with his gold braid and everything. But the C-130 engines burning and turning, because the engines weren't going to shut down. And hear me yelling and screaming in Indonesian, saying hello to the Indonesian and trying to tell him that we were about to take over the airport. And it's ours now.
The operations from there on was to secure the heliport where the squadron was going to stay.
Interfet included troops from 22 nations, including 2 Australian infantry battalions and an Australian armoured cavalry squadron. Other troops included Gurkhas from Nepal, infantry from the Republic of South Korea, Kenya, Portugal, Jordan, Brazil, Thailand, Irish commandos, French regular forces, the British Special Boat Squadron of the Royal Marines, a New Zealand SAS team and New Zealand infantry.
With that great stirring haka, you just announced the arrival in East Timor of the Maori warrior. You are welcome.
America sent no troops, but positioned an aircraft carrier off Dili.
Every contingent that came in understood, first, help the East Timorese and protect them, secondly, help the UN, and thirdly, do your bit to repair and build upon the relationship with Indonesia.
3 Squadron SAS would stay on with Interfet as Cosgrove's multi-purpose ready reaction force.
During the period of Op Spitfire, I spoke to the American security officer for UNIMET contingent, and he said, look, anything that's left after the militia have destroyed them and burnt, you can use. And one of the tasks that I had given to L Troop, which is a vehicle-mounted troop, was to hotwire as many UNIMET vehicles as they could, and to bring those down. There were armed troops driving UN vehicles, so we promptly directed that the UN signs be painted out.
Within an hour or two, we'd managed to get some Indonesian trucks and drive into town. Other troops had already gone off to secure the seaport to enable 3RAR, I think it was, to come in by boat.
An Indonesian submarine watched the landings.
There were thousands of internally displaced personnel inside the port compound. They were secured there and guarded by TNI. The port was like a scene from Hades. There were piles of what appeared to be burning rags and belongings. There was human excrement on the grounds. There were families crying, people clearly disturbed and frightened.
SAS quickly realised that using Indonesian trucks was a strategic mistake.
They saw us as being complicit, in a way, in the circumstances that had led them to being where they were at that time. I can remember thinking, this is the wrong signature, this is the wrong message to be giving these people. There were men armed with parangs and machetes in amongst this, and inside that compound were likely militia elements. It was deep in their psyche that, you know, this was an area that they had fought for and tried to retain, and they were being ejected.
All Indonesian troops and police were to withdraw permanently.
And that was going to be quite a difficult and sensitive thing to deal with. That changeover of force from the Indonesian Army across to the Australian Defence Force, and this third group of militia that were operating within Timor, and especially Dili.
Dili, as a built-up area, sort of gobbled up the infantry soldiers. You'd have infantry sections on street corners. You only need a few street corners and you start running out of infantry.
The clearing of Dili by the infantry battalions in particular was the first, you know, blob in the ink blot strategy that Cosgrove had. You know, secure an area, move on. Secure an area, move on. Stabilise bit by bit by bit was his strategy. But he had to deal with us, of course, because, you know, very quickly, you know, we'd done our job in Dili and we were looking for the next ink block.
The SAS were tasked with understanding the outskirts of Dili. The SAS would go further to the west. They'd go south up into the high ground and tell me what was up there.
We moved out into the areas around the villages, especially the high areas that overlooked the heliport. It was a fantastic vantage point. Obviously, he who rules the high ground rules the valley. So this is the sort of things that we're after. We did recce's about, you know, with all the local towns. We cleared roads from one site to another to make sure they were fine. They were good for the vehicles to travel on.
They'd made contact immediately with Falintal, and part of their job there was to establish the first relationship between this UN-sanctioned force and the guerrilla movement which had stayed in its cantonments.
Gusmao was finally brought home to Dili on 21st October by the SAS.
We put that close personal protection team with Janana Gusmao not simply to provide close personal protection, but to have an understanding of what the man was thinking and what correspondence he was having with Taumatan Ruak, Lire and the various Falintil commanders across the country.
I knew the Indonesians were leaving, but Falintil, as East Timorese and as pro-independence East Timorese, they were staying. Yet they were in these cantonments armed to the teeth. And I needed to ensure that that's where they stayed. And the SAS were my eyes and ears and my voice up with Falintil.
Within 3 to 4 days, I was sleeping in the bamboo hut with the commander, or the deputy commander as he was, Taumatan Ruak of the Falintil guerrilla force. Here we were dealing with a guerrilla force, a small force, but one that had been successful in keeping the Indonesian army on the run for a long, long period of time. Watching Falintil on parade, 20–30% of them wearing the cherry red Capassus beret, you know, recognition of them having killed an enemy in battle and picked up the enemy's uniform. That's where guerrillas get the uniforms from, you know. It's the Q store, it's the guerrilla Q store is the enemy, you know.
In the structure of Falintil was broken into 4 local regions, and I put liaison communication teams with each of those individuals, including with Ruak. And so I was able to understand what was going on across East Timor.
Our guys would live with them, would bathe with them, you know, would do everything that they did.
We'd eat the local food, and when we slaughtered beasts, ate with them and all that sort of stuff.
Including they would come out on some of our combat patrols from time to time. Not in an armed sense, but in a patrolling sense, to give us information and to give us local knowledge. The infantry couldn't do what we did, and it sort of led to as if they were thinking we were fraternising with the enemy. I mean, to us it was a vital source of information. It was one way to get out there and try and stabilise the country. Very interesting.
With Dili safe, General Cosgrove then deployed interfet troops to clear the countryside of militia bands.
Part of the overall philosophy was never to take a backward step, not to sort of grasshopper around the place and risk a setback.
We then essentially raided around the countryside in the first month through access to intelligence of various forms, some classified, but in the main guerrilla supplied.
We had a whole squadron of Black Hawks at one stage, and that was all part of General Cosgrove's view that we needed to get out there and give presence. So our squadron did that. We were a few, but we looked like a many. We actually worked very hard in the early days to give the impression we literally were everywhere.
It was no good just to be seen in Dili and Dili alone. We had to be seen in the outfield. We had to be seen down in Suai, up at Los Palos, down in the Akusi enclave. We had to be seen in all those places.
We maintained such a high tempo of activity that I think we were able to successfully interdict the militia activities to the extent that troops were falling asleep in the helicopters towards the end of those early days.
A number of individuals through the regimental sergeant major said, why are we doing this? Why don't we back off a little bit? Why are we embracing some of these high risk operations? I remember getting all the squadron together and impressing upon them the fact that they should have confidence in their ability and that they shouldn't become too introspective in considering the risk.
The reason we pushed out so hard was we wanted to clear the country of any rascals, I suppose we could call them. And we also wanted to identify who the friendlies were in town all around the area. And this is what the SAS specialise in. It's getting out there, mixing with the locals, identifying their problems and their needs, and then trying to rectify them in whatever way we can.
Pull it open for me.
As far as the intelligence picture was concerned, we knew exactly who we were after. We had photos, we had names, we had all that sort of stuff. One of the guys we're after was a guy called Eurico Guterres.
Saya ingin bertemu langsung dengan saudara-saudara sekalian.
He was pretty much the known leader of the rebels, I suppose. So we were pretty much after him and all of his bandits and all his mates.
The illusion that Interfet was everywhere was greatly facilitated by so-called fast food radio, bought for protecting the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games and operated by the highly skilled 152 Signal Squadron SAS.
Most of the communications were conducted via UHF SATCOM. So the voice is transmitted via UHF frequencies, but it's encrypted in the radio prior to transmission, and of course decrypted automatically at the far end.
We're able to use individual radio equipment that had allowed us to, for example, assault on 360 degrees, very similar to urban building assaults. So we're able to use a lot of skills that had been acquired in counter-terrorism in a operational environment in the field.
The high-tempo raiding united SAS with their old comrades in arms.
The aviation were our combat partners. Credit to them, we've developed an incredible relationship with A Squadron 5 Aviation Regiment through all our years of CT, and we were able to use that to our great advantage.
As they had done decades earlier in Vietnam, SAS attacked the rebel infrastructure.
Based on that guerrilla warfare theory that there's a triangular symbiotic relationship between the guerrillas at the head of the triangle and the underground and the auxiliary. Their auxiliary are their foot soldiers, their support element, and of course the underground providing them with the intelligence and the like. Now, I used that model to leverage off Fallentil, which was an extant guerrilla organisation, to try and separate the underground support that was coming to the militia.
The underground, these are undeclared people, and frequently they're in the employ of the enemy government. So they're policemen who work both sides, you know, the government officials who work both sides, you know. It's where you get your intelligence from. You get it directly from the enemy. So, you know, Fallentil had those people in the underground working for the Indonesian government. A highly dangerous job, as you would appreciate.
SAS also sought the Kopassus Special Forces soldiers, sponsoring the militia.
Identifying a Kopassus soldier from a TNI soldier initially was a little bit difficult. They weren't coming out in their full Kopassus uniforms. You could identify them clearly by the way they acted, their tactics, the way they moved around the place.
Kopassus also wore wigs as part of a militia disguise.
You know, talk about Kopassus in the Enclave and East Timor, there was always the idea that they were there, and initially when we first went in there was no doubt they were there. We came across the Kopassus quite a few times and they were still maintaining the high ground on most of the buildings. They were still trying to take control of the town and take control of the people. They wanted unrest in the town.
For General Cosgrove, we were ground truthing. What was really going on out there?
Was there actually anyone there? You know, were the militia seen? When were they here? The real intent was to find information. Where are the militia?
As Interfet's inkblot spread, the militia bands withdrew west towards the Indonesian border, killing and looting as they went. Fallentil warned one SAS patrol of a marauding band of militia who was spoiling for a fight.
We had human into that. The militia, supported by Kopassus, were pushing people down this river, dry riverbed, pushing them across into West Timor, you know, this continued ethnic cleansing that was going on.
Oddie was posting an observation post and the remainder of his 5-man patrol was in its lying up position to the rear of the observation patrol when they saw about 8 individuals approach them. As they saw this militia element, the militia clearly saw them and they engaged these individuals, killing one and wounding 2 others. And Oddie's patrol was then subjected to 3 separate assaults. They killed at least 1 other individual and potentially 2 or 3 others in those subsequent assaults, which had come from 2 different directions.
There was actually a rolling engagement over a number of hours. We'd actually lost comms with this patrol for a period of time.
Oddie had the sense to come up on the guard frequency, and the guard frequency clearly was always monitored. Could they have the the immediate reaction force to come and extract them from that area around the Nara.
In they went, pulled the guys out, went back, got the packs, and it was all over. I can recall Steve Oddy smelt like a bloke who'd been in battle, and you could tell that Cosgrove was a battle commander. He only needed to ask Steve Oddy a couple of questions. Okay, you know, tell me what happened then, fine. Good work, Sergeant, you know, carry on. You know, it's just amazing to see those hot debriefs, and of course General Cosgrove would have run Canberra and, you know, kept Canberra happy because we'd killed a lot of Indonesians, you know. It gave the squadron, I think, gave all us tremendous confidence that everything that our forebears had done for the last 20, 30 years was proven stuff.
One of the most successful SAS raids was on the port town of Com.
I had intelligence given to me from the Fallentil Underground. There had been 2 nuns massacred up around Com.
Taumat Ruak came to me saying that he had received intelligence from his spies out there that there was this group of militia known as Alpha Team that were in Com corralling large numbers of people, and I think it was the order of thousands, and were putting them on vessels to forcibly move them as part of their plan to clear everyone out of East Timor.
They were about to dispatch Fallentil guerrillas to go down there and kill the militia.
This was exactly the kind of catastrophe that SAS was tasked to prevent. A clash that could escalate into all-out war between Australia and Indonesia.
Effectively, with sort of 15 minutes notice to move, it came down from headquarters, we were at the airfield, that the mission I was given was to fly to Com and stop the fighting. We got together part of a Kiwi troop, an Australian troop, SAS, both of them, and we left for Com. The interesting thing with Com is it's right at the eastern end of East Timor. So it was right on the fuel limits for the Black Hawk for range to get us there. And we also brought in a frigate so they could drop us and then go and refuel. Hadn't done really any reconnaissance work on it, and it was also coming into last light. So we were landing in an area virtually unprotected, sight unseen. When we got on the ground, I communicated back to Colonel Tim. We're on the ground, there's fighting going on in Com. At this stage I think I'm going to go in.
In James's words, there were about 1,500 people inside the compound. They were clearly under duress, and through an interpreter indicated to them they had to give up the militia and they had to withdraw from the compound, or otherwise James's force was to go in and secure the compound and locate the militia in amongst the 1,500 individuals.
So we decided to patrol, obviously very carefully, down into Com. Sporadic shots here and there, a lot of burning in the village. You could see things going on, people running.
I think 7 individuals carrying parangs and machetes were sent outside the compound.
We realised that the real militia weren't there.
He then went back to the compound. He said, you have 1 hour in which to give up the armed individuals inside this compound, or I say to you that we will come through the compound and we will clear the compound of armed individuals.
So we went back and went into a hide up on the high ground, and then waited.
And about half an hour after that, 12 armed individuals, armed with SKS carbines, attempted to sneak out of the compound under darkness.
The militia did not know that McMahon's men were wearing night vision goggles.
They came into our ambush. We picked them up very clearly. We used a lot of live lasers, so lasers to all point at virtually everyone on the road. They all stopped, put their hands up, dropped their weapons, and lo and behold, we caught a whole lot of militia, a whole lot of weapons.
They detained the 12 individuals without having to fire 1 shot, and released the IDPs, who I might say were mightily glad that they were able to be released.
Now, the importance of doing that was obviously to show that we could keep the peace, because that was the mission of the ADF and the Australian government.
In early 2000, 1 Squadron SAS replaced 3 Squadron.
By the time we got in there, one squadron, things had settled down quite a bit.
Oh, this is good, Diggs. Good way to spend 5 months. Go, Rico. Back out again, and we'll continue the tour. Rick areas, satellite television, video, fridges, food.
There was a lot more people coming back into East Timor. In Dili itself, people were sort of a bit of enterprise, setting up little shops and stalls and things like that. And we went out of our way to sort of help them as well. We would get the local people to come and do, you know, chores and tasks for us, which would give them a salary and a wage and help them sort of get back on their feet.
One squadron took over watching for militia sneaking back into East Timor.
As we were inserted by helicopter, everything would usually be done by night. So we'd insert on MVGs. We'd do a few dummy drops, which meant that we'd stop in a few locations before we actually stopped at our primary point. The helicopter would leave, we'd do a listening stop for about 10 to 15 minutes to see if there was any activity in the area. So obviously the loud noise of the helicopter can attract people. More often than not be patrolling at night, but that would be dictated by the terrain. If it was thick vegetation, you can't move at night. You'd have to move during the day. And then we'd move into our OP position, which is an observation post. And once there, we'd set up the routine. Sit there for up to maybe 10 to 12 days, reporting back on daily schedules.
The SAS patrols are very used to working in small groups, being very quiet at night, and you know, low light. Cooking is very minimal, you know, no hot tea or coffee, anything like that. And it's one particular time we were sitting in the middle of the jungle there, and I remember smelling this beautiful aroma of food cooking. And what it was the Gurkhas. The way they eat is they have these fry pans, and they had 3 fry pans out, almost per man. Totally different food to what the locals would eat. So straight away, anyone that was in the area would know there was something different going on. We also work with a group of Kiwis as well, Kiwi SAS, and their tactics are so different from everyone else as well. All their drills are pretty much the same, except they are extremely slow and methodical, almost to a point, if they went any slower they'd be going bloody backwards. But they were good.
For Janana Guzmau's self-disciplined guerrillas and General Cosgrove's Interfet soldiers, East Timor was a triumph of self-restraint and resolute non-violence.
The demeanour of the force acted as a strategic asset. At no stage were people alienated, particularly the East Timorese, but those non-military visitors like the UN, and crucially the demeanour of the entire force, 22 nations, towards the Indonesians was objective but amiable. We didn't seek to pillory or to assign blame for things that had happened. We understood that there were some horrible acts performed, but we didn't come in to be a judge or a jury, simply to provide a shield for people.
Without you, we will never survive. If you don't come on the 20th of September, everybody will die. But you come, our Cyrus. General Cosgrove was the new Cyrus of Timor history, in Timor era.
Timor wasn't a bloodbath they thought it was going to be, because Australians soldiers are much smarter in the way he deals with people. They're much friendlier. And I think it's now showing up the Solomons. It showed up in other areas too, which I suppose you're not allowed to talk about.
And unlike the campaigns in Vietnam, Borneo and subsequently in Afghanistan and Iraq, while we were extremely successful, we had an easy enemy. I suspect in retrospect that the militia's greatest strategic error was in actually running away from East Timor. If the militia had stayed in East Timor and demanded enclave status as the Falentil guerrilla force had, we would have had a devil of a problem in sorting that out. It would have been a nightmare.
Go, Curry.
For the SAS, their skills of strategic peacemaking, crucial for success in counter-terrorist warfare, were well proven.
To me, it was at last the unit being used in that operational sense on those operations that are difficult, are dangerous and are sensitive, and getting in there first. And it was a reinforcement that at last the regiment was starting to be used in a number of roles that it was well suited for.
3 Squadron was awarded a meritorious unit citation for outstanding service in East Timor. Now, after decades of creativity, hazard and sheer hard work, the SAS regiment was finally, manifestly, Australia's force of choice. SAS had, at long last, achieved its cherished mantle.
The SAS had been sort of compartmentalised from whatever else the Army was doing while it was coming to terms with counter-terrorism, the evolution of Special Forces operations. And here it was a sort of a drawing of the veil and an exposure of both their tremendous talents, but also a developmental opportunity for them.
In fact, for the SAS, East Timor marked the start of over 2 decades of intense operations, both large and small. At dawn, on 24 August 2001, about 140 kilometres north of Australia's Christmas Island, a small wooden fishing boat, the Palapa 1, overcrowded with men, women and children, mainly Afghan refugees, began to break up. It was heading for Australia. The Norwegian ship Tampa, alerted by Australian authorities, reached Palapa 1 in time and rescued all on board the sinking boat. Under international law, survivors of a shipwreck should be taken to the closest suitable port, in this case, Australia's Christmas Island. But Australian Prime Minister Howard refused Tampa permission to land the refugees, describing them as illegal arrivals or queue jumpers.
We first had to deploy there in very short order, which was done via the Air Force, with a force package that was tailored to meet all sorts of contingencies. So it needed boats and all sorts of things.
We knew that they had some rescuees on board. We understood that some were agitated. We also understood that some required medical assistance. So the challenge for us was to put together the best possible package to manage that situation should we be tasked to board the Tampa.
Duncan Lewis, he was the commander of Headquarters Special Operations, and he had 2 telephones. One telephone in one ear was SASR, Gus Gilmore, and in the other hand he had another telephone in the other ear, which was the Prime Minister John Howard.
We received instructions on an hourly or half-hourly or 5-minutely basis from Canberra. It's not often you see that sort of direct command of a military unit in such a tight situation.
Tampa Captain Rinan had reported 10 refugees unconscious and needing immediate medical evacuation, and 100 with diarrhoea. But Prime Minister Howard stood firm.
It will not be given permission to land in Australia or any Australian territories.
Frustrated refugees rebelled, smearing their excrement below decks and threatening to jump overboard. Captain Rinan refused Australian demands to turn the ship around, dropped anchor off Christmas Island and asked again for medical aid.
Things changed, advice changed, direction changed, and essentially our job was to do what we were advised to do, which was to eventually board the ship and take it under control.
When Captain Rinan saw the SAS troopers approaching, he assumed they were the medical assistance he had requested. He realised his mistake too late to raise the ladder. The SAS boarded the Tampa. The SAS squadron commander climbed to the ship's bridge and calmly tried to persuade Captain Rinan to leave Australian territorial waters. Rinan refused. Rinan declared that, with more passengers than lifeboat capacity, legally his ship was unseaworthy.
There was obviously a a concern at all levels, from government right down to our forces on the ground, on what legal authority the interception was taking place under.
Nobody really had time to think about it, and it was very much a tactical operation or strategic operation controlled tactically by government.
We really went to the Tampa not sure what we would find when we boarded, so we had a fairly heavy medical package as part of the overall task group, and the doctors and the medics went straight to work on providing medical assistance to those that required.
The Tampa did not have enough toilets for almost 500 people, and the deck had become unsanitary. SAS hosed down the deck, cleaned up the filth and provided extra toilet buckets. Some empty cargo containers were opened for refugee shelter.
An immediate priority for the teams that were on board were to build a rapport with those that had been rescued, and they did that by improving the hygiene of the conditions that they were living in, bringing fresh food, providing medical assistance and playing games with the kids.
I rang the Special Forces commander, the SAS commander that was on board the ship, and asked him what was going on, expecting him to tell me that there was a bunch of steely-eyed soldiers going about their business. And he said to me, "Oh, boss, they're actually cooking." So here we had a bunch of SAS soldiers that were actually putting on meals for this cargo of what was at the time human misery.
To forestall possible legal action against Australia for the SAS boarding, Prime Minister Howard tried to pass retrospective border protection legislation, legalising the seizure of Tampa.
This is an unusual bill for unusual circumstances.
The bill was rejected by the Senate. Howard successfully appealed to the High Court, and the retrospective legislation covering the boarding was passed.
I think government learnt to lean on us a lot over that particular period.
The refugees were never landed on Christmas Island. New Zealand accepted many of them, and the rest were transferred to the Pacific island of Nauru by the Australian Navy. Later, almost all of them were accepted into Australia.
There's no doubt that the situation on board the Tampa could have turned out quite differently. If, for instance, we'd had to launch an opposed boarding of the Tampa, if the command element on the ship had been unable to build a rapport with Captain Rinnan and his crew, if the medical emergencies on board had been beyond the capabilities of the doctor and medics that we'd sent aboard, if the agitated people who'd been rescued were unwilling to trust the SAS to improve their quality of life on board, then all of those factors could have played out in a completely different way, and the tactical situation could have been very unstable.
I'm only one simple seaman who got caught up in circumstances beyond my control.
Captain Rinnan was honoured with a commemorative plaque by the SAS counter-terrorist squadron.
A short time later, 9/11 arose, and where there was the potential for witch hunting and going over this whole incident with a fine-tooth comb, I think our deployment to Afghanistan and 9/11 helped move us on.
Timor was training wheels for all of us, but there were no training wheels allowed in Afghanistan. You had to hit the ground against a ruthless and very skillful enemy.